Guards are synonymous with medieval fantasy. In movies, games, books, and memes, the ever present guard is always there to make idle chit chat, making judgmental remarks about my choice of equipment, and simply begging to be wabberjacked or modded by the main character. But as someone who looks at history for inspiration, what can we learn from history to inspire our own guard forces in our own fantasy and fiction? So let's begin with the most important question when delving into this topic. Did guards exist in real life in medieval Europe? And the short answer, no, not really. The idea of a guard force comes from our modern ideas of police, a state-funded organisation whose job it is to keep law and order, wouldn't exist in the UK until the invention of the Bow Street Runners in 1749, long after the end of medieval Europe. So then what did law and order look like in medieval settings? By the way, this video is going to explore the ideas of Western medieval Europe, specifically Britain, because that is what I'm most familiar with. If you know examples of guards or other type of policing in medieval period in other parts of the world, please share them below and I will probably learn something as well. Wait a minute, before we start, are you not subscribed to this channel?
Stop! You violated the law. Pay the court a fine or serve your sentence. Your stolen goods are now forfeit. Then pay with your blood!
But let's start off with the thing that most resembles the guards that we would understand from modern fantasy, and that is the position of watchman. Now, the main job of a watchman wasn't to stop crime, it was to watch for fires, and they would patrol their local settlement, keeping an eye on things. However, they did have some powers to intervene if they witnessed a crime. Now, the main thing to understand about watchmen is that they were an entirely voluntary force. And aside from maybe getting a pint from the local, it was an entirely unpaid role, with people volunteering to be watchmen and often serving on a rota. So why did people do it? Well, those who volunteered were usually highly respected members of the town, and although some would have loved the official title and some level of power, many seemed to volunteer out of a civic duty. So then what did watchmen look like? Well, they just looked like some blokes. There was no uniform. A watchman would most likely wear their day clothes as a watchman. As for arms, there is some evidence of them carrying pole arms like a billhook, but mostly things like cudgels and clubs seemed more common. And how did they deal with crime when they came across it? Well, that's where the club comes in. Threats and roughing up lawbreakers seemed common, but punishments such as fines and public humiliation, such as stocks or the pillory, were also common, especially for drunkards. What a way to sleep off a hangover. This all may seem strange from a modern perspective, that these everyday people with no training and very little actual authority to be given this level of power. But in medieval times, views on crime were very different than they are today. Back in the days of yore, if you witnessed a crime being committed, it was your moral and civic duty to raise awareness to the crime and intervene to stop it. Again, this feels strange where in the modern day, if we witness a crime, we would most likely call the police. Well, unless you don't. And then the police would have the authority by law to intervene. But if you're a traveller in a medieval town and you're caught stealing from one of the locals, you're much more likely to be beaten by an angry mob and chased from the town than spend any time in a cell. Huh, maybe Skyrim is more accurate than I give it credit for. And this local view on crime and punishment brings us to the next level of historical guard equivalents, militia. Now, a militia is another voluntary force, comprised of locals who can band together to defend their town if required. Much like watchmen, as its volunteer, militia would usually provide their own individual arms and armour. Meaning a small village militia was usually comprised of a bunch of peasants brandishing whatever farming tools happened to be nearby, but town and city militias were often comprised of the well-to-do middle classes and yeomen, meaning the equipment they could purchase was often to a good standard. And although an irregular force, many town and city militias would meet regularly to train and drill, often creating a surprisingly competent force. If a settlement were under threat from bandits or potentially monsters, the local militia would raise to the challenge. If a settlement were under threat from bandits or potentially monsters, the local militia would usually rise to the challenge. But why mention them here when discussing guards? Well, in tough times or active threat, the militia could act as guards themselves, keeping order on the streets with regular faces, especially as many were respected members of the town. There is also some evidence to suggest that local militias often guarded the gates of towns and would man the defences and watchtowers, making them a very visual aspect to a town's defence and upkeep. And, much like the watchmen, they could issue fines and public humiliation for any of those that they called breaking the law. If anything, if your party is murder hoboing their way around a town and terrorising a local populace, they will most likely have to contend with the militia, who are far more professional than a 5e guard stats would let you believe. There were, however, some more official titles and roles within medieval law enforcement. The lowest ranking of these were constables. Constables are another voluntary position. However, this one was usually elected by the people of a settlement and they would usually oversee the watchmen, organise the militia, keep records of crimes, settle local disputes, and was ultimately responsible for keeping the peace. Depending on the area, some constables would serve for a certain amount of time and then the position would be re-elected. Others would serve for a longer period of time depending on local traditions. Constables are probably the closest historical example we'll get of guard captains that you get so commonly in fantasy. There were also some higher ranking positions that would actually have been paid for their time. Although going by a few names, the most common of these were reeves or bailiffs, a member of the court who would oversee a certain area. Port reeves, for example, would oversee disputes at ports and other areas of trade, and shire reeves, where the term sheriff comes from, would overview larger areas, or shires as they're known in the UK. The modern equivalent of reeves are probably judges, where local people could bring their legal complaints and deal with more serious criminals and crimes that the constables would otherwise struggle to handle. The reeve would work with local enforcement to ensure law and order. In times of war, reeves were also commonly responsible for looking after the militias, raising troops, and defending certain key areas. In many areas, knights also fulfilled a very similar role and would normally have the final say on the land in which they owned from the king. Now you'll notice this entire time I've not said anything about jails or serving time sentences, and this is because in medieval times, jails weren't really a thing for common criminals. The only time people would be in jail would either be if they're facing the death penalty and awaiting execution, or are very rich and were captured in battle and were awaiting ransom. Almost all medieval punishments were dealt with quickly and severely. For the most part, these were things like fine and public punishments that we've mentioned previously, but things like executions and brandings were also very common, especially for more serious offences. So how does all this apply to your world building of fantasy? Well, the first thing I think that people need to consider is how your party interacts with this. If your party commits a crime in one town, likely the Shire Reeve will hear about this and will pass news on to other towns as well. Reputation is something that will follow your party very quickly. And if your party does more serious crimes or are murder hoboing, they are very likely to face a very organized resistance quite quickly, organized by a quite efficient form of law and order. The stat blocks in 5e really don't give guards justice, especially town and city militias were often quite well equipped as mentioned previously. And so your party might have more of a struggle committing crimes in a town and bullying the local guards than they might otherwise believe. I've always thought the best way of stopping murder hoboing is to talk honestly with your players. The second best step is to have a good deterrent in place. And especially when your party is potentially facing execution for more serious crimes or branding, it becomes a very serious issue. Now, how does this look in a fantasy world? Well, fantasy might very well change how militias and local law enforcement works. For example, whilst history didn't really have a full-time professional guard force, in a world in which monsters like trolls and ogres are a lot more common, there might be more call for it. So, as always, this should work as inspiration rather than a rule, as fantasy will often adapt how forces will develop and may change considerably to the historical narrative. And that is our exploration of medieval guards and law enforcement and how to implement them into your own fantasy worlds and world building. I hope this has been quite helpful into understanding what medieval law enforcement looked like. I think there is a level of assumption of what our fantasy world should look like, and really I find that quite limiting. So hopefully this has provided some level of inspiration to you and your world building, and will enable you to punish those murder hobos a little bit easier in the future. But for now, I've been Bearded Halfling, and thank you for listening.